After having finished the big four, respiration, phonation, resonance, and articulation, posture is not one of the big four, by the way. We have reached the top of the hill and a great time to do a mini review. We created a foundation for our instrument with posture. We covered breath support in our respiration unit. The breath that we managed passes over the vocal folds in phonation, and the tone created there is amplified in resonance. Then the breath-rich, resonant tone is formed into words in articulation. Now we find ourselves at text. This is not a technical category in vocal pedagogy parlance, but a designation I have claimed as one of my 9 tenets. In Mimic the Muse, text is all about making sense of the words we have created. Text is arguably the most important thing we do, for if we can't convey the message properly, then we have abdicated our duty. It is fitting that Calliope, the muse of epic poetry and therefore the chiefest of the muses, will help us. When we sing, we have to know what the words mean, both literally and figuratively. In a foreign language, it is crucial to obtain a translation of the general sense of what you are singing, but also a word-for-word translation. In a choral situation, the conductor will provide this. In private voice, you are encouraged to seek out your own translation. However, be wary of poetic translations that appear under the original non-English words in your score. In order to make the English words rhyme and fit the meter, the meaning is obscured. Often we have the privilege of singing the finest poetry ever written, as well as gems of the folk genre and rites from holy books. Whatever it is, we have to understand the words. For this unit, let's explore a 17th century poem by Edmund Waller entitled Go Lovely Rose, a poem with 4 quintains, or stanzas of 5 lines each. You may pause here and read the entire poem, although we will concentrate on the first quintain. As you can see, the speaker is someone in love, and in the entire poem he is speaking to a rose. He tells the rose to appear to his beloved, whom we can assume is shy about her beauty. He wants the rose to be an example to her. He wants her to notice that the rose is beautiful and that the rose does not try to hide its beauty, and that it is appropriate that the rose's beauty, like hers, is admired. He further wants the rose to die in front of her as a cautionary tale to his beloved that the beauty she deprives him of does not last forever. We then have to make judgments about the poem. Now that I've analyzed it, I could decide that the poem is coercive on the part of the speaker. Then I may choose not to perform the piece, or I may contextualize it in some way. For our purposes, let's assume that the poem is a pure and respectful expression of love and admiration. Now that we understand the meaning, we have to phrase in such a way to make the poetry as intelligible as possible. It is important that a phrasing scheme is developed for each piece. In a choral setting, the conductor will tell you what that is. If you are singing solo, either you will decide where to phrase, or the scheme will result from a collaboration between you and your teacher. Once the scheme is solidified, don't vary from it in your practice. The bottom line is this: the goal of a phrasing scheme is primarily that the poetry be as clear as possible. That's why I usually say to phrase and not to breathe, because the latter is less important. That is why text falls under logos, or clear. Therefore, as you go through the score, the first decision is to determine whether the words should be broken up for the sake of clarity. Any kind of punctuation can suggest a phrase break, although it does not have to. Once you've decided where to phrase, then you have to practice and see if your breath support can achieve it. Perhaps you have linked 2 phrases that you cannot sing in one breath. That's why we mark phrases in pencil and stay fluid. Thus, you might boil all this down to 2 considerations: what is ideal versus what is possible. Before we start creating a phrase scheme for this passage, we have to understand how rhythm works. The biggest pitfall with phrasing, in my experience, is that so many singers look at phrasing as something ethereal and mysterious. It is not. There is absolutely no guesswork to it. That is, if you understand rhythm, in particular, keeping account of the subdivisions of the basic beat. I set this quintrain to music so that we could explore both simple and compound meter. I have placed blue notes above the staff to indicate what and when the basic beats happen. Basic information to remember. A quarter note is the basic beat in simple meter and contains 2 eighth note subdivisions. A dotted quarter is the basic beat in compound meter and it contains 3 eighth note subdivisions because a dot means half again as much as the note that precedes it. Look at measure 7. Simple meter, when the bottom number is 4 in this case, has a quarter note, hence the number 4, as the basic beat. And that basic beat has 2 subdivisions. Look at measures 7 and 8. The top numbers, in our case 4 and 2, means that there are 4 and 2 beats per measure respectively. Look at measure 3. Compound meter, when the bottom number is 8 in this case, has a dotted quarter note as the basic beat, and that basic beat has 3 subdivisions. Now hear me. Compound meter is difficult to talk about at first because the tendency would be to say that in 6/8 there are 6 beats, top number, per measure, and the 8th note, bottom number, gets the basic beat. However, given that compound meter is often faster in tempo, we would say that in 6/8 there are 2 beats per measure and that the dotted quarter gets the basic beat. This is most obvious in measure 6. To be clear, there are indeed 6 eighth notes in a 6/8 measure. But if you divide the top number by 3, you are left with 2 basic beats, each containing 3 subdivisions. From here on out, keep your ear on the subdivisions because that's where the phrasing usually happens. Sometimes you might be asked to phrase on the basic beat, as I will show you later. If you are in a choir and the conductor has not specified whether to phrase on the half beat, subdivision, or the basic beat, ask him or her. Let's be systematic. We will go phrase by phrase. You will write commas, here in green, to indicate places where you want to phrase. Then we take the philosophical into the practical, in pink, by altering the rhythm to provide a rest for phrasing. That is, if the composer has not already provided one. You may choose to notate the rhythmic alterations in your score, but after you get the hang of it, you won't need to write down the rhythm anymore. Look at measure 1. Go, lovely rose. In this phrase, you have 2 punctuation marks. You will choose to phrase after rose, and you may also, if you think it would add more dimension, phrase after go. Yes, I am suggesting that you can phrase after singing only one word. And just because you phrase there doesn't mean you have to breathe there. You can just suspend the breath after go. For our purposes, let's phrase at both places. In the first instance, we have to make the quarter into an eighth and add an eighth rest since we want to do what's most customary. Phrasing at the subdivision level, that is. In the second instance, we have a half note, so we can take a breath on the main beat if we want. So let's do. We make the half note into a quarter and add a quarter rest. Measure 2 does not require a phrase. There's just no place where a phrase would be appropriate. You can't break after tell her because it would beg the question, tell her what? You can't break after wastes her because the audience would wonder, wastes her what? In measure 3, since the comma ends a complete thought, we have to phrase here. We change the quarter into an eighth and add an eighth rest. No phrase in measure 4 because the word knows is extended into the next measure, which brings us to measure 5 and an unspoken rule in the singing profession. When a textual phrase is repeated immediately, You just about have to phrase between them. You can't sing that now she knows that now she knows. Therefore, a break is needed after the downbeat of measure 5. Change that quarter note into an eighth note and add an eighth rest. Are you detecting a pattern? Measure 6 presents you with an interesting decision. You may ignore the comma and carry that now she knows when I resemble her to thee. That is completely appropriate. Breaking after knows is also appropriate. First decide which you think most serves the text, and then decide if your breath management can handle it. For our purposes, let's carry it over. Now we're in measure 7, where a break is required after thee. Again, make the quarter note into an 8 and add an eighth rest. Now let me ask you, are you going to phrase after the first, how sweet? If so, why? Yes, because how sweet is repeated immediately. Again, make the quarter into an eighth and add an eighth rest. But wait, there's more. In the following discussion, the red characters that appear will not be what you write in your score, but will be what will happen on the rest. Let's not assume that just because we have added a rest, that nothing at all will happen in that rest. On the contrary, one of 3 things will happen in the rest you have made. Please go to the measures I mentioned. I'll give you time. If the syllable preceding the phrase mark ends in a vowel sound, as in measures 1, 3, and 7, then absolutely nothing will sound, indicated here with dashes. If the syllable preceding the phrase mark ends in a voiced consonant, as in measures 1, the word rose, and measure 5, then that consonant and a shadow vowel, only lasting an instant, will happen in the rest you've created. The quality of the vowel can be anything neutral, but I prefer the as in good. For example, rose. If the syllable preceding the phrase mark ends in a voiceless consonant, as in measure 8, that consonant and its air will sound on the rest. Now let's hear the passage. In the background, you will hear an eighth note click, and this is the pulse that you should always be aware of while you are singing. There will be a measure of eighth note subdivisions before I sing so that you can easily establish that pulse. As a foreshadowing for our upcoming discussion on phrase shape, notice how I emphasize stressed syllables and employ some dynamics. Follow along in the score.
Go, lovely rose, tell her that wastes her time and me, that now she knows, when I resemble her to thee. How sweet and fair she seems to be.
Next, we come to shaping the phrase. This is done in part by leaning on stressed syllables. Every phrase is different. The most important thing is that you should never sing a melody with equal weight on every syllable. Just as the speaking voice has rise and fall, so should singing. A good composer will make phrasing easy, and one reason why singing teachers love assigning Italian, beside the fact that the vowels are so straightforward, is that Italian phrases often build to and away from a stressed syllable toward the end of a phrase, creating a pleasing musical slope. Take Handel's Ombra mai fu.
Di vegetabile carai amabile.
Finally, a word about stagger breathing. In a choral situation, if you run out of air, you can sneak out, grab a breath, and sneak back in, but don't do it at a predictable spot in the music. For example, if you had to sneak a breath in measures 5, 6, and 7, you wouldn't breathe at the comma. You would breathe at an unlikely and even unmusical place like this.
That now she knows when I resemble her to thee.
It's important to devote time to poetry analysis and invest in learning music theory, in this case rhythm. Then you will internalize not only the story you are trying to tell, but also the technical means of conveying it.